Amazing speakers today on this track, and it's a big honor for me to introduce them to the audience. And now, I'm pleased to welcome on this stage a creative person who is not only a lead-level artist at EA DICE, worked on Battlefield and Mirror's Edge, but also a passionate gamer, science geek, dog fancier, and a power lifter, so be careful. And please meet charming Linnea Harrison. Please welcome.
Hear me? Okay. Привет! It's really exciting to be here in Moscow. Thank you. And to be here at DevGam to get to talk to you guys about the creative process behind Battlefield 4. Now, before we get started, I just want to ask, how many of you guys have played Battlefield 4? Cool. All right. So you guys will kind of know what I'm talking about. Are there any Battlefield veterans? Have you guys played Bad Company, Vietnam, 1942? Oh, nice. All right. So you guys have a good legacy of Battlefield and will understand some of the references that I'm going for. Did you guys know that Russia is the third biggest country to play Battlefield in the world? That's pretty exciting. You guys are playing a lot of Battlefield. So today, my talk is going to be about the dynamic part of Battlefield. So as you guys know, multiplayer is the coolest, right? Everyone loves multiplayer. But the part about multiplayer that's difficult is that anything can happen, right? It's not a scripted story. It's not linear end to end. You know, someone's going to lose and someone's going to win, but otherwise anything can happen. You can get, jeeps on helicopters shooting down megalodons in the water. So that's the really beautiful thing about multiplayer, and that's the thing that I'm going to try to talk to you about today. What's exciting with a dynamic world, but also what's difficult in creating one. So the outline for the talk today is fairly straightforward. We're going to talk a little bit about what our goals were going into Battlefield 4 in the beginning, what we wanted to accomplish, and then how we did that with our artwork, going through storyline, and then how we mirrored that with our new technology. And I'm going to look at technology that's been in Battlefield games before, like destruction, but also looking at new stuff that we implemented in Battlefield 4, like Levolution and our dynamic weather system. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about one of our levels and how we took it from the very, very beginning, the first idea, all the way to the very end. So going into creating Battlefield 4, there were a lot of challenges that we faced. This was not our very first Battlefield, so it wasn't brand new. There are 14 Battlefields, not including DLC or unannounced canceled projects. And there's a lot of FPS games out today. There's Halo, there's Call of Duty, there's Arma, there's all kinds of stuff. So we really needed to make sure that we were aware of the other FPS games that were out in the market, and that we made sure that our game was tailored to Battlefield fans. We also had a changing audience base. When Battlefield first came out a long time ago, the players that were playing then are now starting to become adults. They're having kids. They're much more mature, and so we needed to make sure that our game, while still being really fun at its core, was also maturing with our audience. We're also facing a new console generation. How many of you guys have a PS4? All right, a few of you. How about an Xbox One? It's like one person with an Xbox One. That's okay, you're gonna get more games. But it was really difficult to make a game for so many consoles. We were building for PS3, Xbox 360, we were building for PC with Origin, and we were also building, and that was low-end, medium spec, and high-end PCs as well. So it was a big range of PCs, and then also building for PS4 and Xbox One. So that was a bit challenging, especially since when we were developing the game, the consoles had not yet come out. So the specifications were still changing on a monthly basis. So in order to achieve a good game in face of these challenges, we set out with some goals. We wanted more destruction, right? Who doesn't want more destruction? Blow everything up. It's super cool. We wanted to listen to our players, because our players are the most important part of Battlefield, right? Without the players, there is no game. Without players, there's no servers, there's no multiplayer. It's not fun without all the players. So we wanted to make sure that we made what you guys want come to life. And we also really wanted to focus on quality and innovation, because those are good things, right? But we quickly realized that we couldn't just put in more destruction, right? If we wanted to run at 60 FPS on the new consoles, we couldn't just cram in tons and tons of destruction everywhere. So we decided instead to make smarter destruction, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. We needed to make sure when we listened to our players, like I said, we didn't just listen to our old veteran Battlefield players. We needed to make sure that we were listening to all the new players that were coming in. Like, you know, new players, when you first join a server and you jump in a helicopter and you think, yeah, this is going to be cool, but then it just kind of like flops and blows up and everyone's like, oh, noob, get off the server. And it doesn't feel very good, right? Like, you want to learn how to fly a helicopter. You want to be really badass. You want to drive a tank. You want to do all the cool things. So we needed to make sure that we created something for our new players as well, which is why we made the playground where you could test out a bunch of stuff. And then we realized that quality and innovation, you can't really have both. It's a trade-off, right? If you've created something for a really long time and you're very experienced, you're going to create a high level of quality. But if you're creating something for the first time and if you're innovating all the time, then it's not going to be as good as if you're really experienced in making this. So it was a trade-off between having some new elements that were really cool and exciting, but also doing what we did really, really well and continuing that in our new game. So one of the things that we wanted to focus on with the arts perspective in Battlefield 4 was our environmental storytelling. And this wasn't just in multiplayer, this was a lot in single player, because you can't walk up to a player and be like, hey, by the way, there was a tsunami, right? That's kind of less exciting than actually experiencing and living in a place where there's a large natural disaster happening. And how do we communicate that? Well, we have lots of cars trying to exit the city, causing a blocked up side. And this really tells a story that there's something going on, that everyone is leaving. They're absolutely trying to get out. No one's trying to get in. And that's a little bit more compelling than just some character telling you, oh yeah, by the way, there's a storm, which is not as exciting. We also didn't want to tell small stories. We didn't want to just focus on, putting some trash by the side of the street and saying, oh yeah, someone had a sandwich and then they threw away their trash and they litter. That's not very exciting. We want to tell these really big, epic stories that'll really rock you to your core. And we needed to make sure that these stories weren't just in set dressing, they were also echoed in the weather, in the effects, in the audio, and also in the encounters, that the encounter tension kind of got heightened with more and more AI when that emotional arc was happening. So I'm going to show you a quick video here so you can see how this reference was brought to life in the gameplay. And we use this reference here to not allow the player to move forward.
To the north, the other side of that highway.
Crossing backwards ahead.
I think so. I think that's our gate through the city. You got a point, Rector.
So this is a really tense part of the story in Battlefield, where you're breaching the shore here and you're trying to make your way into the city. And we wanted to kind of create this feeling of tension, like you can't get past this blockade of cars, so we have to send a tank in. And of course it's really cool when a tank rolls over cars, so that was, for free. It is pretty cool. But it was a little bit difficult to make and make that run well with performance. But so we wanted to have these cool elements, but you also see there's a lot of effects, there's a lot of debris flying past you, there's wind pushing the trees and shaking them, and there's this dark contrasted environment in the sky and in the lighting. So that's something that really helped heighten that emotional moment for the player there. Now I'm going to go through with you just a really basic example that I threw together about communicating to the player through use of objects, effects, and set dressing. So you want to tell the player, don't go in here, right? This is not a place where you want to be. But you don't want to just put up a giant sign that says, don't go in here, right? You want to make it a little bit more subtle, a little bit more immersive, a little bit more of an experience. So you could put up a fence, right? That's step one. But of course in Battlefield you can knife fences and just run through, so that's not going to stop our players. So you could go a step further, add an electric box and maybe a little electrical sign that gives you the idea that this is an electrified fence, so if you touch it, you're probably going to die in the game or take damage. But you can still push that even further. That's probably not enough for most players. They're still not going to see that electric box, and they're not going to make the connection. So then you can start putting sparks on and sound effects like buzzing when you get up close, so that you know there's something different about this fence. Maybe I shouldn't touch it. And then if you want to go really over the top, you can go a little crazy with your set dressing and really tell a story of a guy who didn't pay attention to these signs, touched the fence anyways, and this is what happened to him, so maybe you shouldn't touch it. This is a little bit too far for our Battlefield game. Again, we wanted to stay mature and serious in some of our set dressing and our storytelling, so we would probably dial it back to here. But of course, if you have a crazy, fun, over-the-top game, feel free to go for it. Another really important element when building worlds and building spaces for us was making a believable infrastructure. This was something that we actually struggled with a bit in the beginning of the Battlefield 4 development. As you guys may know, DICE is located in Stockholm, Sweden. Stockholm, Sweden is really far away from Shanghai. They're not the same place. Many of us had actually never been to Shanghai, but we were trying to build a city and build a world and build a game in the space of Shanghai. So we started with a lot of reference images, and you start building stuff, but there's a lot of details that you kind of forget when you're building things, like exactly how do the roads work, right? How do the road markings line up with the edge of the road? How does the sidewalk match up with the building? How wide are the sidewalks? What are the rules there for traffic? If you have 2 lanes, if you have 1 lane, if you have one-way traffic, how do you signify that there's a crossing? These sorts of things we kind of took for granted and started building in a very Swedish and European way. The city started looking very, very Swedish in the beginning, and we kind of felt that it wasn't quite right. So we reached out to our colleagues over at EA Shanghai, and we asked them to help look at our game, give us feedback, and to go out and gather reference for us what we could be doing better and help us build this game to make it much more believable that you're in this space. Because part of the fun, I mean, some people just play Battlefield to shoot other people, but some people play it to get this epic story, to live in these cool locations, and to experience what being in the middle of a war zone in another city would be like. And that's kind of what we wanted to give our players. So you can see here that there's a lot of attention to detail when it comes to having small little road signs on the side and the placement of the trim along the sidewalk, and with the building, the type of ventilation that they have. We had to study how do they build ventilation in skyscrapers in Shanghai so that we would know where those were placed. So all of these details kind of go into building this space, which when you're playing in it you don't really notice. It just creates this believable infrastructure for the world. So I'm going to go back to another little tutorial on creating believable spaces. In the real world, none of the objects are snapped to the ground or auto-rotated 90 degrees or 180 degrees, right? They're all kind of happening organically wherever they were placed, unless it's a building that was built specifically for that purpose. Trees always grow at a slightly slanted angle, following the contour of the landscape and the angle of the sun. Man-made things also have imperfections that you have to pay attention to. Like, there's no such thing as a perfect edge or a perfect surface. Everything has a little bit of wear, tear, some story in it that you have to bring to life as an artist. And you really have to respect the surfaces of where your object is placed. What is the material? Is it dirt? Is it concrete? Is it placed on a slope? Is the ground soft or hard? How would it wear around with time and water and wind? Take your time thinking through these things, and you will really get a much more believable approach. So these are the same objects, just rearranged with those principles in mind. The ground isn't perfectly flat. The stones are kind of they're soft in the dirt because the dirt would form around them, and the trees are respecting those angles by growing slightly at different angles and at different sizes. So it can go a long way with just using the same assets over and over and over, but just changing them slightly. Again, from a design perspective, if you're trying to create some cover for your player, it's important to not just place out default rotated on a flat plane objects. For instance, these 3 rocks, if you're trying to create some cover choices for your player, you could instead start working with the terrain, shaping it a little bit, pushing the rocks into the terrain a little bit, and scaling them and rotating them so that it feels that the curves kind of follow the natural form of the terrain. And if you want to go one step further, you can start working with foliage and vegetation. Where would the vegetation grow? It would grow in the crevices between the rock and the dirt, where the water would probably lay a little bit longer, where the soil is probably a little bit more nutrient rich. So these are principles that you can kind of put into your spaces that make the world much more believable, even when you don't know about these things. Okay, now on to the cool stuff. I want to talk a little bit about the technology that we used when creating Battlefield 4. And of course, Battlefield 4 was fueled by Frostbite 3, which is a very powerful engine. And they added some cool updates just for our game, which allowed us to create the dynamic weather and the Levolution. A lot of the improvements were really great for us to get, but it made us work in a very different way, and I'm going to have to try to cover that. Sometimes new tech can come at a cost when we have to redo content, and then we have to plan for that with a bit of padding. So to create this dynamic tech that would respond to the dynamic weather, it was kind of the half-step point to PBR in that we had to create shaders with dynamic and reactive properties, and we couldn't go overly heavy and bloated with a lot of the processes that we were running in the background or the calculations that our shaders had to do. So we had to stay as simple and lean as possible while still making them dynamic and reactive. The same happened with vegetation and soft meshes. We had to make sure that they were skinned properly with rigs that wouldn't pull apart when the weather and the wind really pushed them to their extremes. In the end, though, this content and this workflow became very second nature to us, and it's something that moving into the PBR workflow has really, really helped. Now I want to talk about everyone's favorite thing in Battlefield, destruction. And I'm sorry if I kind of ruin the magic of the destruction, but I'm just going to go over really quickly how we implemented destruction in a smarter and more realistic way, and how we tried to make it feel like you were in a very physical and destructible world. First, we had to start with a very clear visual language. Everyone knows if it's red and you shoot it, it's going to blow up. And that's the type of language that we tried to use throughout everything, but in a more subtle way. So you understood that a wall looked destructible, that a window looked like you could break it. Because there was a lot of spaces in our game that we didn't want the player to access, but we didn't want it to feel like, oh, well, we can destroy this wall, but not that one. So we really had to approach it with a visual language for destruction. We had several types of destruction that we categorized in order to make the play spaces feel more dynamic. We had a micro destruction, we had a macro destruction, and then we had building destruction and cinematic destruction. So they're all different levels. Our cinematic destruction is mostly like chipping off little pieces. And it's the most expensive type of destruction, but it really gives you that feeling of pressure when you're taking cover like behind an object and you see little pieces of it flying off in your face and you think, oh God, I have to move, I have to get this guy, and I have to find other cover because this is not going to last. It's mostly aesthetic, and you know, it does add to a lot of the feeling of pressure, but it's not large gameplay changes. Like, it's not going to change the complete strategy of a space, right? Like, the space is still generally going to feel the same. So we tried to keep these types of destruction in the most populated areas. So around bases where conflicts happen, that's where we would place this. We wouldn't place this type of destruction at the spawn point where you don't really get any battles. So we're just going to look at this destruction real quick. So as you can see, it takes a bit of fire to chip off small pieces. It's maybe not the most strategic way to kill an enemy that's on the other side, but it will happen in a firefight, and taking cover behind those will save you for a little bit, but then you have to move off. And then we have our macro destruction, which is breaking through walls, and that was really used heavily in Battlefield 3, and we continued that in Battlefield 4. This allows players to create new routes or increase visibility throughout the level, open up sniper sights and stuff. Then we also have our building destruction, which is very popular and definitely one of the things that has the most effect on the gameplay. The structures that collapse after a certain amount of player-induced damage are generally classified as building destruction. Players that are caught in the destruction in the building while it's being destroyed will get killed. And most of the point of the gameplay area is to change the routes, right? So if the building at first offered some protection and like a vantage point for snipers, you could take it down to make sure that you could cross it easily with a vehicle, and that the snipers could no longer use it as a good vantage point. So I'm just going to show this to you. Sorry for the Skype. And of course I have Skype on in the background. Sorry guys. But that's definitely a very rewarding and cool type of destruction in our game. And then lastly, we have our cinematic destruction, which you guys, if you've played Battlefield, you've probably seen the giant skyscraper coming down or radio dishes crashing, that sort of stuff. And this is always linked to the theme of the level. Like, we always have to make sure that the Levolution and the theme of the level drives the destruction. It's not just a separate event, and it really has to affect a large portion of the gameplay. So for instance, in the Siege of Shanghai, it completely changes the middle base from being this really high up strategic vantage point where you can just parachute to other bases and snipe anyone to being completely flat. So it's a really good way to change the tide of battle. And that's always, you know, the cool, everyone thinks it's awesome, and it is, because it feels really cool when you make that happen, because the player is the one that triggers these Levolution events. Speaking of Levolution, I wanted to talk a little bit about how we implemented that through Battlefield 4. We needed to make sure that players were aware that Levolution mechanics existed, because sometimes they were very subtle, like a door that you could close on the side of a train or a bollard that you could raise to stop vehicles. These are not necessarily very obvious if you don't know about them in advance. We also wanted to make sure that we maximized the emotional impact, because a lot of times someone would raise bollards or someone would, you know, make the skyscraper fall down. But if you just spawned in on a level, you wouldn't necessarily know that, so it wouldn't change your strategy, and you would approach the base as if it was still there, and you'd say, well, now my loadout is completely useless. So we wanted to make sure that everyone was informed by what happened, so we made sure that we used shaders and effects and sounds across the map to really inform players, and we had to push that much further than we originally had to make it really readable. We also needed to make sure that we added these elements without removing the core focus of the Battlefield experience, and that was a little difficult to do at times, because sometimes the gameplay would end up being all about the Levolution, right? You wouldn't focus on shooting other people, which is kind of the point of getting the tickets down and winning the round, usually. But our team really had to come up with a bajillion ideas in the beginning. As you can see, some of these sketches eventually became actual Levolution items in our game, and some of them were easier to implement and some of them were harder to implement, and that really required a lot of playtesting on the part of our Levolution pod. It meant coming up with a bunch of ideas and figuring out what was easiest to implement for the lowest amount of cost, and what would be coolest. So we had a couple more expensive Levolution moments in there, but it really helped to have this process of rapid iteration and be able to prototype, rule out, redo, refine, and polish the Levolution events that we thought were really cool. I also want to talk a little bit about our water and weather system in Battlefield 4. It's a much more subtle and secondary aspect to the game, but it adds a lot in terms of the emotional impact. For instance, if you're playing on Parasol Storm, and it starts out with this, fairly beautiful, calm, beachy islands in the middle of the tropics, and then at the very end, it's this raging storm with huge, rough peaks of foam and, boats crashing into the islands and stuff falling over. It really heightens the emotional impact if you're trying to win a game and you're running out of tickets and the other team is running out of tickets and you're right there at the edge and there's wind and there's stuff falling around you and there's lightning and it's very dark and very scary. It kind of heightens the emotional experience for the player. The difficult part with our water and weather system, as I mentioned before, was creating this flexible content that could react to the state of the weather. So everything had to tie into that, from shaders to particles to animations and rigs for destruction in trees and assets. We created a lot of grounding principles before starting our levels, and that's what really helped us create a good set, a good visual target for our levels. So we started our game development process by laying out these principles, not just for our artists, for our designers, for everyone working on the game, so that everyone would work by the same rule set. And we needed to start with the big brush strokes. We wanted to contrast detail and space, which means that you have large spaces of terrain with points of focus. And you can see this here in our Golmud Railway screenshot, where it is a very open and airy sort of level, focused mostly on vehicle gameplay, but you need to also know where the bases are, which is why we place these electrical poles or points of more contrast, or all of the lines are converging on where that base is. We also needed to lay a good groundwork with our visual target, and by creating a set of assets that were highly polished. We only had a few of them. We only had 5 or 6 per area. But by having these assets, we really made sure that that we could use them and create a very high quality throughout all of our levels. So you can see here, we only have 2 trees, 1 terrain, really, with 3 shaders on the terrain, and 1 rock. And that's being used over and over and over again with that rule work that I laid out earlier. Just slight rotations, slight scaling, and respecting the landscape and the terrain and how that would actually work to achieve this visual quality, which we then were able to move into our levels once we had designed them well and created a good sandbox space. The same worked with our water as it reacted to the shoreline and became darker and deeper depending on the depth. And this would always create a groundwork rule set for how we applied these principles into our levels. Sometimes I would get a little tired of our normal levels, so I would just walk around in our visual target. It was always so peaceful and calming. And then we had a visual target, not just for the forest, we had one for the beach, we had one for the city. So all of our areas, all the types of maps that we created had a visual target to follow along. And then we moved on to the pitch of each type of map. So here are 4 pitches for levels at the very beginning of Battlefield 4. Do the Dishes is the one that I'm going to talk about, which eventually became Rogue Transmission. I don't know if you guys have played that. Who's played Rogue Transmission? That level. Yeah? A few people? Okay, cool. I worked on that. It was a cool level. There were a couple other pitches. We asked everyone in the studio to pitch game ideas and level ideas. And some people pitched, Stockholm Archipelago. Didn't really get made into a level because it's A, not located near China, and B, it wasn't as fun for the vehicle gameplay. There was mostly water. And Avalanche Town and Prison Break eventually got combined to create Operation Locker, which was the prison level on the side of a mountain, very high up in the snowy mountains. We had over 100 ideas pitched, which we boiled down to 14 ideas, and then eventually we shipped 10 levels. So it was very difficult to get rid of some very cool ideas, but it was worth it in the end to just create the best and most exciting levels we had to offer. Then after the pitch and the ones that we picked were decided on, the level would go into a concept phase. The concept artists would create quick sketches of what the space could be, not just the dish, which was the whole focus, but also the other areas, what the other bases might look like. And then we start white boxing in the level, and they do paint overs of that to really try to highlight what is the gameplay going to be here, what is the lighting going to look like, what is the compelling point in this level. And then we worked into prototype phase, where it's beautiful, right? I did that. It looks pretty good. I think it needs more pink. We white box and quickly put up all of the elements of the space to test it and see if it plays well. And this is the point where we can change things very easily. We can move mountains. We can raise water. We can be gods of our worlds, really, and change things very quickly. And this is the point where, I don't know if you guys are very familiar with Rogue Transmission in the end, but at this point, the bases are much more further apart, and they're much narrower together, and that mountain actually got removed, and the spawn point got pushed much further back in order to respond to being not only good for rush game mode, but also conquest, and also looking at our other game modes. And then we went into a 5-day sprint for this level. Sometimes our sprints are a little bit longer, but this is a period where we take 4 or 5 artists and designers and we really just focus on this and make sure that this level gets to the highest quality possible. So this is how it started at the beginning of the 5 days. And at the end of the 5 days, after focusing on these big brush strokes, we had changed the terrain, we had changed the lighting, and we had changed the shaders on the large dish. That's all we did. That's all we did. But it changes a lot, right? So we focused on these big things, and we're able to really get a very different, much more polished looking level out of this. And of course, the level changed quite a bit until the very end. But you can kind of see some of the differences here between the prototype phase and the end of the 5-day sprint. And then at the very end, we went into full production, where we added even more polish, even more assets, and that little cherry on top. After the production was ended, we went into heavy play testing, making sure that we could tweak small routes and placement of bases, and making sure that we could get proper cover in for infantry. After playtesting, we released the game, and that was very exciting for us to get to see the players really take hold of what we had created and play it in ways that we had never thought possible. So I just want to send a big thank you to you guys from the Battlefield 4 multiplayer team. We worked really hard on this game, and we're really excited that you guys are playing it, even still today. So, yeah, thank you. If you guys have any questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm impressed, and I'm sure the audience are impressed as well. And now we have time for questions. I just want to remind you that you have to mention your name, and please one question for one person, okay? Thank you.
Hello, Lenny. I'm Sergey. So I have a question. You told a lot about the destructions, about destructible levels in Levolution, and the most counter opinion to this kind of design is this: it's hard to balance the maps that changes a lot during the gameplay. So how you balanced it and how you deal with it?
So how do we think about destruction when designing and balancing our maps?
How you balance it,
For before and after.
destructible maps,
Right,
and how
well,
you dealt with the balance.
That's actually a very difficult process and something that I struggle with every map that I make. It's always a challenge. But really what helps a lot is to have very early white box destruction in at the very beginning phases of the map. So we have very, very silly white box, like you saw our white box level. It looked like that, but it's like there's a wall and you can destroy it, or there's a cover and when you shoot it, it'll disappear. So that very quickly mimics the gameplay that the destruction will have, and we can place out and say, well, we definitely know that we want to have some walls here to block off the gameplay, but we want to make sure that it plays really well when that's opened up, when it's completely free. So it can be very difficult if you don't design a level with that in mind from the beginning. And a lot of the balance comes from making spaces that are tight for vehicles that they can't necessarily go through even when things have been destroyed, that there's going to be rubble there, there's going to be debris. So the balance really comes from having that early prototype and thinking about it from the beginning. Thank you. Are any of you guys playing Battlefield Hardline, by the way? Show of hands.
Hello,
A couple
Hardline.
Hi.
It's okay, but Battlefield series is the best. I think, I mean, military ideas. All of these cops and bandits, new, but Russian military country. My name is Albert, thank you very much. I want to ask about a pipeline. So, man hours, time, how much, how big team you use to create such beautiful maps. So about the timing, I mean.
Okay.
And do you have any case of full redone something after maybe play tests?
Yeah. So some of our maps were much faster and easier to make. For instance, Rogue Transmission, which we just looked at, took about 3 months. Total time. I mean, it was stretched out. We kind of stopped here and picked it up there, but 3 months total time for production on that with 1 or 2 people on it at all times. And then we have other levels like the Siege of Shanghai, which is our big showcase, downtown Shanghai, huge destruction, very complex, large map in the middle of a city. And that took up around 8 or 9 months to create, beginning to end. So I would say that we try to make a few that are like these larger landscape for vehicles, and those are usually the faster ones for us to create because we're so experienced with using the terrain tools. But building a giant city with a huge skyscraper was very new to us, so that did take quite a bit more time. Thank you.
More questions? Okay, if you don't, just ask it in English. I can help you with the translation. So, okay, one more question, yeah.
Hi, my name is Slav, and the question is, can you talk a little bit about the optimization of Levolution and destruction? So do you have some kind of a fixed budget for, I don't know, something for polygons, objects, stuff like that? So do you do any LODs or whatever?
Yeah, so the optimization there, again, had to be very dynamic as a system because we were shipping on so many different platforms. So, right, the requirements of a PS4 are very different from the requirements of an Xbox 360. Yes, we used LODs, levels of detail, and we had to be very aggressive with those levels of detail, cutting by at least half of the budget every single time we stepped through a level. And in terms of working more specifically with the optimization, we have, I mean, it's different for every engine you're in, right? Every engine has its pros and its cons. And Frostbite is very strong in having these large, expansive spaces. But of course, having destruction in there, you're going to end up not occluding all of the objects in the space. So for us, it was really important to think about the performance very early on in the process, to say we can't just have a giant open space. We need to have some objects in the middle so that you can't see everything at once. And it was very important early on to say, you know, for instance, with the destruction, that we're going to cluster it around where people will actually experience the destruction. I can't really talk specifically about budgets because that changes from game to game, and it's very, very engine specific. So I think if you're using another engine like Unreal or Unity, those budgets are going to be completely different. But for us at least, we were able to have fairly decent sized textures and quite nice poly counts. We just had to be very, very aggressive in our LODs and our culling of those objects in the world.
Thank you.
Thank you. Also, if you guys have any other questions after this, I will be around the conference, or you can just email me at linnea.harrison@dice, or find me online anywhere else.
Any more questions? Okay, if no one has a question, then I have. You talk more a lot about challenges, but what you enjoyed the most while working on Battlefield 4?
Oh, what did I enjoy the most? We had a period where anytime your vehicle ran into an object, it would just skyrocket up into space. That was kind of fun. The Megalodon, that was super fun when players started saying, connecting dots and finding these little clues, and then the Phantom Project, like finding all these little clues. It was really fun to watch all of our players like unravel these stories and these really cool things that we get excited about and nerd out about, like, you know, Easter eggs with dinosaurs and stuff. Like, that's always super fun when you guys are as excited about it as we are. So I think sharing that with the fans and sharing the excitement of these little things that we've placed in that are ours and our secrets, that was really rewarding.
Cool, sounds great. Thank you so much. Thank you guys for your questions.
Thank you.
So there are more coffees, a better morning. So we have another coffee break. See you here in 10 minutes. Enjoy.